Welcome back, readers. Happy Sunday morning. I got a typewriter, this cheap Korean typewriter, so it has more tactile. You know how I said I like to physically write? I meant like I have journals. I have all these journals full of my book, and they're basically like sectioned out in certain ways. But I can go through and highlight them, and then take the parts that I like, and then type them because it's more pleasing to type when you have a raised keyboard. I don't like typing on a laptop. It sucks. But I've solved that problem, which is making me much more productive. So I have two teas, two lemons, and we're going to read my favorite Franz Kafka story, which is called In the Penal Colony. "It's a remarkable piece of apparatus," said the officer to the explorer, and surveyed with a certain air of admiration the apparatus, which was after all quite familiar to him. The explorer seemed to have accepted, merely out of politeness, the commandant's invitation to witness the execution of a soldier condemned to death for disobedience and insulting behavior to a superior. Nor did the colony itself betray much interest in this execution. At least, in the small sandy valley, a deep hollow surrounded on all sides by naked crags, there was no one present save the officer, the explorer, the condemned man, who was a stupid-looking, wide-mouthed creature with bewildered hair and face, and the soldier who held the heavy chain controlling the small chains locked on the prisoner's ankles, wrists, and neck, chains which were themselves attached to each other by communicating links. In any case, the condemned man looked so like a submissive dog that one might have thought he could be left to run free on the surrounding hills, and would only need to be whistled for when the execution was due to begin. The explorer did not much care about the apparatus, and walked up and down behind the prisoner with almost visible indifference, while the officer made the last adjustments, now creeping beneath the structure, which was bedded deep in the earth, now climbing the ladder to inspect its upper parts. These were tasks that might well have been left to a mechanic, but the officer performed them with great zeal, whether because he was a devoted admirer of the apparatus, or because of other reasons. The work could be entrusted to no one else. "Ready now," he called at last, and climbed down from the ladder. He looked uncommonly limp, breathed with his mouth wide open, and had tucked two fine ladies' handkerchiefs under the collar of his uniform. "These uniforms are too heavy for the tropics, surely," said the explorer, instead of making some inquiry about the apparatus, as the officer expected. "Of course," said the officer, washing his oily and greasy hands in a bucket of water that stood ready, "but they mean home to us. We don't want to forget about home. Now, just have a look at this machine," he added at once, simultaneously drying his hands on the towel and indicating the apparatus. "Up till now, a few things still had to be set by hand, but from this moment it works all by itself." The explorer nodded and followed him. The officer, anxious to secure himself against all contingencies, said, "Things sometimes go wrong, of course. I hope that nothing goes wrong today, but we have to allow for the possibility. The machinery should go on working continuously for 12 hours, but if anything does go wrong with it, will only be some small matter that can be set right at once. Won't you take a seat?" he asked finally, drawing a cane chair out from among the heap of them, and offering it to the explorer, who could not refuse it. He was now sitting at the edge of a pit, into which he glanced for a fleeting moment. It was not very deep. On one side of the pit, the excavated soil had been piled up in a rampart. The other side of it stood the apparatus. "I don't know," said the officer, "if the commandant already explained this apparatus to you." The explorer waved one hand vaguely. The officer asked for nothing better, since now he could explain the apparatus himself. "This apparatus," he said, taking hold of the crank handle, leaning against it, was invented by our former commandant. I assisted at the very earliest experiments and had a share in all the work until its completion. But the credit of inventing it belongs to him alone. Have you ever heard of our former commandant? No. Well, it isn't saying too much if I tell you that the organization of the whole penal colony is his work. We who were friends knew even before he died that the organization of the colony was so perfect that his successor, even with 1,000 new schemes in his head, would find it impossible to alter anything, at least for many years to come. And our prophecy has come true. The new commandant has had to acknowledge its truth. A pity you never met him, the old commandant. But, the officer interrupted himself, I'm rambling on. And here stands his apparatus before us. It consists, as you see, of 3 parts. In the course of time, each of these parts has acquired a kind of popular nickname. The lower one is called the bed, the upper one the designer, and this one here in the middle that moves up and down is called the Harrow. The Harrow? Asked the explorer. He had not been listening very attentively. The glare of the sun in the shadeless valley was altogether too strong. It was difficult to collect one's thoughts. All the more did he admire the officer, who, in spite of his tight-fitting, full-dress uniform coat, amply befrogged and weighed down by epaulets, was pursuing his object with such enthusiasm, and, besides talking, was still tightening a screw here and there with a spanner, not a spammer. Spammer in the works, I was thinking. I gotta look up spanner, guys. I have 2 words so far filed away. Read! Don't listen to audiobooks. Make them. Smart Pisces, fresh from the Archdiocese. As for the soldier, he seems to be in much the same condition as the explorer. He wound the prisoner's chain round both his wrists, propped himself on his rifle, let his head hang, and was paying no attention to anything. That did not surprise the explorer, for the officer was speaking French, and certainly neither the soldier nor the prisoner understood a word of French. It was all the more remarkable, therefore, that a prisoner was nonetheless making an effort to follow the officer's explanations. With a kind of drowsy persistence, he directed his gaze wherever the officer pointed a finger, and at the interruption of the explorer's question, he too, as well as the officer, looked round. Yes, the Harrow, said the officer, a good name for it. The needles are set in like teeth of a harrow. The whole thing works something like a harrow, although the action is limited to one place and contrived with much more artistic skill. Anyhow, you'll soon understand it. On the bed, here the condemned man is laid. I'm going to describe the apparatus first, before I set it in motion. Then you'll be able to follow the proceedings better. Besides, one of the cogwheels in the designer is badly worn. It creaks a lot when it's working. You can hardly hear yourself speak. Spare parts, unfortunately, are difficult to get here. Well, here is the bed, as I told you. It's completely covered with a layer of cotton wool. You'll find out why later. In this cotton wool, the condemned man is laid, face down, quite naked, of course. Here are the straps for the hands. Here for the feet. Here for the neck, to bind him fast. Here at the head of the bed, where the man, as I said, first lays down his face, is this little gag of felt, which can be easily regulated to go straight into his mouth. It's meant to keep him from screaming and biting his tongue. Of course the man is forced to take felt into his mouth, for otherwise his neck would be broken by the strap. Is that cotton wool? Asked the explorer, bending forward. Yes, certainly, said the officer with a smile. Feel it for yourself. He took the explorer's hand and guided it to the bed. Over the bed. It's specially prepared cotton wool. That's why it looks so different. I'll tell you presently what it's for. The explorer already felt the dawning interest in the apparatus. He sheltered his eyes from the sun with one hand, gazed up at the structure. It was a huge affair. The bed and the designer were of the same size and looked like 2 dark wooden chests. The designer hung about 2 meters above the bed. Each of them was bound at the corners with 4 rods of brass that almost flashed out rays in the sunlight. Between the chests shuttled the Harrow on a ribbon of steel. The officer had scarcely noticed the explorer's previous indifference, but he was now well aware of his dawning interest. So he stopped explaining in order to leave a space of time for quiet observation. The condemned man imitated the explorer. Since he could not use his hand to shelter his eyes, he gazed upward without shade. Well, the man lies down, said the explorer, leaning back his chair, crossing his legs. Yes, said the officer, pushing his cap back a little and passing one hand over his heated face. Now listen, both the bed and the designer have an electric battery. Both the bed and the designer have an electric battery each. The bed needs one for itself, the designer for the Harrow. As soon as the man is strapped down, the bed is set in motion. It quivers in a minute, very rapid vibrations, both from side to side and up and down. You will have seen similar apparatus in hospitals, but in our bed the movements are all calculated precisely. You see, they have to correspond very exactly to the movement of the Harrow, and the Harrow is the instrument for the actual execution of the sentence. And how does the sentence run? Asked the explorer. You don't know that either, said the officer in amazement and bit his lips. Forgive me if my explanations seem rather incoherent. I do beg your pardon. You see, the commandant always used to do the explaining. But the new commandant shirks this duty. Yet, that's such an important visitor. The explorer tried to deprecate the honor with both hands. The officer, however, insisted that such an important visitor should not even be told about the kind of sentence we pass is a new development, which he was just on the point of using strong language, but checked himself and said only, I was not informed, it is not my fault. In any case, I'm certainly the best person to explain our procedure since I have here, he patted his breast pocket, the relevant drawings made by our former commandant. The commandant's own drawings? Asked the explorer. Did he combine everything in himself, then? Was he soldier, judge, mechanic, chemist, draftsman? Indeed he was, said the officer, nodding assent, with a remote, glassy look. Then he inspected his hands critically. They did not seem clean enough for touching the drawings. So he went over to the bucket and washed them. Again. Then he drew out a small leather wallet and said, Our sentence does not sound severe. Whatever commandments the prisoner has obeyed is written upon his body by the Harrow. This prisoner, for instance, the officer indicated the man, will have written on his body, Honor thy superiors. The explorer glanced at the man. He stood, as the officer pointed him out, with bent head, apparently listening with all his ears in an effort to catch what was being said, yet the movement of his blubber lips, closely pressed together, showed clearly that he could not understand a word. Many questions were troubling the explorer, but at the sight of the prisoner he asked only, Does he know his sentence? No, said the officer, eager to go on with the exposition, but the explorer interrupted him. He doesn't know the sentence that's been passed on him? No, said the officer, pausing a moment as if to let the explorer elaborate his question, then said, There would be no point in telling him. He'll learn it on his body. The explorer intended to make no answer, but he felt the prisoner's gaze turned on him. It seemed to ask if he approved such ongoings, so he bent forward again, having already leaned back in the chair, put another question. But surely he knows that he's been sentenced. Nor that either, said the officer, smiling at the explorer as if expecting him to make further surprising remarks. No, said the explorer, wiping his forehead. Then he can't know either whether his defense was effective. He has no chance of putting up a defense, said the officer, turning his eyes away as if speaking to himself, so sparing the explorer of his shame of hearing self-evident matters explained. But he must have had some chance of defending himself, said the explorer, and rose from his seat. The officer realized that he was in danger of having his exposition of the apparatus held up for a long time. So he went up to the explorer, took his arm, waved his hand toward the condemned man, who was standing very straight now that he had so obviously become the center of attention. The soldier also had been given the chain a jerk, and said, This is how the matters stand. I've been appointed by judge in this penal colony. I have been appointed judge in this penal colony. Despite my youth, for I was the former commandant's assistant in all penal matters, and know more about this apparatus than anyone. My guiding principle is this: guilt is never to be doubted. Other courts cannot follow that principle, for they consist of several opinions, and have higher courts to scrutinize them. That is not the case here, or at least it was not the case in the former commandant's time. The new man has certainly shown some inclination to interfere with my judgments, but so far I have succeeded in fending him off, and will go on succeeding. You wanted to have the case explained. It is quite simple, like all of them. The captain reported to me this morning that the man who had been assigned to him as servant and sleeps before his door had been asleep on duty. It is his duty, you see, to get up every time the hour strikes and salute the captain's door. Not an exacting duty, and very necessary, since he has been a sentry as well as a servant, and must be alert in both functions. Last night the captain wanted to see if the man was doing his duty. He opened the door as the clock struck 2. There was the man, curled up asleep. He took his riding whip and lashed him across the face. Instead of getting up and begging pardon, the man caught hold of his master's legs, shook him, and cried, "Throw that whip away or I'll eat you alive." That's the evidence. The captain came to me an hour ago. I wrote down his statement and appended the sentence to it. Then I had the man put in chains. That was all quite simple. If I had first called the man before me and interrogated him, things would have gotten into a confused tangle. He would have told lies, and had I exposed these lies, he would have backed them up with more lies, and so on and so forth. As it is, I've got him, and I won't let him go. Is that quite clear now? But we're wasting time. The execution should be beginning. I haven't even finished explaining the apparatus yet. He pressed the explorer back into his chair, went up again to the apparatus, and began, "As you see, the shape of the Harrow corresponds to the human form. Here is the Harrow for the torso. Here are the Harrows for the legs. For the head there is only this one small spike. Is that quite clear?" He bent amiably forwards towards the explorer, eager to provide the most comprehensive explanations. "I was drowned, refused crust of bread. I was crowned with a spike." My roommate's coming. Limited computer access and this 4 people sleeping in my room. But tune in next Sunday, guys. We're getting to part 2 of this trilogy, which is A Beautiful Story by a Dead German Man. Hare Krishna.